What is up, guys? This is Weasel for PokerWeasel.com. Congratulations, you made it. This is the last part of the Fundamental Theorem series, part 7. We're going to talk about misconceptions when defending. Here's the contents for this episode. Firstly, the effect of implied odds on draws, the effect of reverse implied odds on draws, the impact of leverage on made hands, and the impact of bluff potential on a later street. Everything we look at today is going to revolve around very basic concepts. In particular, we're going to be thinking about implied odds and future expectation, and also the opposite of implied, which is reverse implied, and how they damage our future expectation. Everything is going to stem from very basic principles about the game. We're just going to look at a few different ways where players commonly misapply these basic principles. So if we think about one particular way where players get it right most of the time, this is the effect of implied odds on draws. For example, we're on the flop. Let's say we have a flush draw. We face a pot size bet. We know we're only going to hit our flush draw just under 20% of the time in the next street. And the pot odds are according as 2 to 1. We actually need to hit 33% of the time to have a profitable call based on direct pot odds. But of course, no one goes around folding their flush draws. They know that they have very good implies if they hit. If there are stacks behind, we're going to be able to make up for the fact that we don't have the direct pot odds. So this is an example of a situation where players typically get it right, but there are many similar situations where players get it wrong and they maybe put too much emphasis on the pot odds they're getting and not enough emphasis on the future expectation of the hand. Just to help illustrate the expectation of the basic concept here, we're going to have a look at a spot where we have the nut flush draw on the turn. So we're out of position, we're in the big blind. Our range is simply ace-10 of diamonds. We just have one holding in our range. And our opponent essentially has top pair with a king kicker. We've given him all combos of king-queen in this case. So if we just have a quick look at the equities here, in terms of raw equity with our flush draw, you can see that we are 25.9% equity. We're an underdog in this situation, but we're going to assume that our opponent's betting roughly half pot. So you can see there's 20 in the middle. We've isolated roughly the break-even point, which is going to be a bet sizing of 10.8 from our opponent. If you have a look at our expectation here, you can see that it's 0.006. We're going to call that 0 for all intents and purposes. We're going to assume that there is no additional action on the river. We might as well assume that button is all in for his last 10.8 big blinds in the spot, and we are facing a break-even call with our flush draw. Basically, we have no implied odds here. There's no future action. So if we get exactly break-even pot odds call, our expectation is going to be 0. I just want to clear up a common misconception here, and it's one that's been touched on earlier in the series. This does not mean that big blind is breaking even, or at least it doesn't mean that in the absolute sense. Big blind is making a loss here. He's actually losing pretty much everything he's invested in the pot right now. We're starting off with a pot of 20, and probably both players have invested roughly half of that. That essentially means that big blind's expectation is going to be minus 10 big blinds for the overall hand. He's actually losing here. So he's only breaking even relative to the current situation, which is almost imagining he's invested nothing and saying there's 20 big blinds in the middle. There's not really going to be a difference between calling and folding. And the common misconception here is players sometimes think that when they make a break-even call with their flush draw, it actually means it's break-even for the overall hand. So they're actually breaking even. And such a viewpoint is going to give rise to the idea that calling in this spot is significantly better than folding. Because if you call, you get to realize your equity, whereas if you fold, your expectation's 0. You've lost everything you put into the pot. Whereas calling, at least you get to take some of your equity back from the pot. You realize some of your equity. Well, that's actually false here. Even when you make a quote-unquote break-even call here, you're actually going to be down 10 big blinds for the entire hand, because that's what you've invested up to this point so far. By saying 0 EV with respect to the current street, we're essentially saying there's no difference between calling and folding in this spot. So it is losing, but there's nothing we can really do about that. It's not our fault we necessarily ended up in this turn situation. We can only make the highest EV decision with respect to the current street we're on, and we're basically indifferent between check calling here and check folding. They're going to have roughly a similar EV. You can see that our expectation of the check call is actually minus 0.006, which is mostly negligible, but technically we'd probably choose to check fold over this since check folding has an EV of 0. Let's move on now to our next model, which basically demonstrates the profitability of having implied odds. We know we have a roughly break-even call due to pot odds. In some cases, you might have a losing call due to pot odds, but we're not really that concerned with our direct pot odds unless we're in an all-in situation. So long as there's future play, we can't look directly at our pot odds, and that's going to be the key idea behind this video. We're going to see how that applies in various different situations. Now let's take a very basic implied odds situation. We know we have pretty good implieds here with our ace-10 of diamonds simply because we're drawing to the nuts. That's very, very important. There are cards in the deck which will give us the nuts by the river. And what that means is we can feel very comfortable with investing as much of our stack as possible on the river, which generally means we're going to have good implied odds. If the converse of that is true, which is we make a hand which might be the best hand, but it's potentially dominated some of the time, and we're not really sure how much additional chips we're allowed to invest, that's generally a situation which is going to result in reverse implied odds. And as we're going to see, that basically means even if you have the direct pot odds to call, you should sometimes be folding, because it's very important we consider the impact of the future action. Now in this particular tree, which may or may not be realistic, we're going to discuss why it doesn't really matter too much. So firstly, what is this tree telling us? Well, the turn play is the same. We check, our opponent bets, we call with our draw. We know in terms of equity it's roughly break even if we look at our direct pot odds. Now basic idea for the river is this. If we make a flush, we are going to bet. We're going to bet 30 into a pot of 41.6, and our opponent is always going to call. Now we know that might not be realistic. Maybe he can occasionally fold some of his range. We're going to assume that he just calls in that case. And we're going to assume that if we don't make a flush, we're just going to check, and our opponent, who pretty much always has the best hand, apart from a few occasions where we maybe make an ace and he has king-queen, he's just going to check back, so we get to realize our equity. But most of the time we're going to lose if we find ourselves in this part of the tree, because it means we didn't make a flush and we know our opponent has king-queen. Now when we run this model, we're not going to be too concerned about the exact expectation that we generate now, given that we have these increased implieds. And the reason is the tree is not going to be that realistic, in the sense that a few things will not be how they are in this tree. For example, our opponent is not necessarily going to call every single time. Okay, maybe he's going to call king-queen, maybe he folds king-queen, we don't know. But he's also going to have other hands in his range, some of which he'll fold, some of which he'll call. So the idea is we'll sometimes get paid off, we'll sometimes get folds. Also, the other thing is, let's be realistic here. A lot of the time when we check call out of position on the turn with a flush draw and we hit our flush, well, we might donk bet the river, but we also might check again. So our implieds could be a function of how often our opponent's gonna bet the river when that diamond completes, assuming that we check fold the rest of the time. Also, there's going to be some scenarios where we make an ace, or maybe we hit a 10 in this case, we check and our opponent checks back, and we end up being good against some of the holdings in his range, so that can have an impact on our expectation as well. So we're not going to be interested in the exact increase in our expectation. It's not going to be relevant. We just want to see how this works. We just want to see that now our expectation is going to be higher because we have some river implieds. So we're basically interested in the qualitative change to this model, i.e. our expectation is higher, rather than the quantitative change, the exact value, not really too important for us. So let's run this model. So we know before our expectation was roughly 0. We can now see our expectation is 5.73 BB. Notice that we're still losing this hand, because if we assume we've invested about 20 big blinds, we've invested about 10 from our own stack, and we're basically walking away from the hand with respect to the turn, having a profit of 5.73 BB. But when you look at the overall hand, we've invested 10, we're actually still making a loss despite the fact that we have a profitable call in terms of implieds. It's just that now, relative to our other option on the turn, which is to check folds, meaning our expectation is 0 with respect to the current street, we're basically losing 10 big blinds for the overall hand, but we have the choice to just lose 4.27 big blinds or so for the overall hand. So we're still going to make a loss overall, but with respect to the turn, our defender is going to be profitable in this case, and we're no longer indifferent between check folding and check calling because we have those river implieds. So we've seen a demonstration of how implied odds work. Now let's talk about reverse implieds. Generally speaking, reverse implieds are the opposite of implieds. So it's pretty much impossible to have a situation where you have both of these simultaneously. You can't have implied odds and at the same time have some reverse implieds. these two factors generally balance each other out. So if you have a ton of reverse implieds, it basically means you don't have any implieds. If you have a ton of implied odds, it means you don't really have reverse implieds. Think of this as somewhere on a fixed point scale where 0 is basically you're all in and you only care about your pot odds. Whereas if the slider's over to the right, now you can generate profit as a result of your implieds. But if the slider's to the left of that point, it means that you're going to lose money on later streets. But that slider can only be in one point or the other. It can't exist in different points of that slider. Either you're going to be generating implieds or you're going to be generating reverse implieds. Now, just as we don't necessarily need to get the direct pot odds if we have good implied odds, so we can call without the odds knowing that we can generate profit on a later street, reverse implieds function in exactly the opposite way. We might even get the direct pot odds, but calling is still going to be a mistake. We're going to end up potentially losing so much more in the later streets that it doesn't matter that we get the direct odds, we may still have to fold the hand. Now, it's this idea that's going to be less intuitive to many players. This is where mistakes are going to arise. We get the idea that you don't need pot odds because you've got good implieds, but many players don't necessarily get this idea of, okay, you get the direct pot odds, but you still can't call because you have so many reverse implieds here. You'll especially see this kind of concept in pre-flop situations when players face a 4-bet. So a basic idea is our opponent makes a really small 4-bet against us. We feel that we must get the best price to call, so we click the call button. But when we look at the type of hand that we're calling with, we'll find that it's going to be heavily dominated by our opponent's 4-bet range. And what that typically means is, if we make the best hand, we're probably not going to get paid off. If our opponent makes the best hand, we'll very often make a second best hand, which means we stand to lose quite a lot post-flop. For example, maybe a situation where we have something like King-Queen, and our opponent has a bunch of stuff in his range like Ace-King, Ace-Queen, Aces, Kings. Now, of course, we get a very good price, and when you have a look at the equity, you might find in some cases that we do actually have a call. Maybe our opponent even has something like Queens or Jacks in there, which we can flop a good pair against. But let's say we flop something like a King with King-Queen. Either our opponent's going to have Queens or Jacks, and he's not going to pay us off, or he's going to have something like Aces, Ace-King, Pocket Kings. We're going to end up in a situation where we're heavily dominated. So when that money does go in, we're nearly always going to get the worst of it, because if we make the best hand, our opponent's going to put next to nothing in the pot. Now, this might seem like a basic concept, but the truth is, even high-stakes professionals do not understand this. Now, we're not saying that you have to understand this in order to be a winning player, but let's just say it's very common that even high-stakes players think that their pot odds pre-flop is somehow a lot more relevant than it actually is. So you'll hear them say stuff like, well, I get the pot odds facing this 4-bet, therefore I'm going to call. The expectation of that is not necessarily going to be positive as a result of the entanglement we're going to find ourselves in post-flop. We can't generate a positive expectation in the post-flop scenario, so it doesn't matter that we get the direct pot odds pre-flop. Most players don't understand this. Even very good players don't necessarily understand this on an accurate level. Generally speaking, the idea of reverse implies, to think of a more post-flop scenario now, mostly applies in situations where we have some kind of non-nut draw. So some examples of this are going to include situations where we have maybe a 7-high flush draw and it's possible our opponent has the ace-high flush draw. Also include situations where maybe we do have the ace-high flush draw, but there's already a pair on the board. These are situations that you need to be very, very careful with as poker players. Even if you get the right pot odds, it doesn't mean that you should necessarily be calling. Maybe our opponent just has the stone cold nuts, we're drawing dead, he's actually just setting us up for a river situation where we make our flush and we end up losing even more money against his nuts. It would have actually been better if we just folded the hand on the earlier street despite potentially getting the right pot odds to make the call. It's better that we just fold. That call is going to carry a huge amount of reverse implieds. Now, we're not saying for a minute that you should always fold non-nut draws. Non-nut draws do have an important place in Hold'em and they should be played in a variety of situations. You know, there are situations, for example, where maybe we have the second nut flush draw, and we know that it's possible our opponent could have the nut flush draw. We know that we might hit our flush and we end up getting stacked by our opponent's nuts. But because he has so many worse hands in his range, we can still say that the net result of that is that we're going to have good implied odds when we make the second nuts. we can chalk that up to a cooler when our opponent makes a better draw than us, because we know that he's going to be paying us off with the third nuts, the fourth nuts, the fifth nuts. So the net result is that we do still have implieds, even though we can potentially lose to some stronger hands in our opponent's range. So it's not a case of always folding non-nut draws, it's about being able to accurately assess whether our draws benefit from implieds or suffer from reverse implieds. It works exactly the opposite way around as well. Maybe we've got something like a 5-high flush draw on a paired board. We're not saying that it's impossible that our opponent's going to somehow get all of the money in bad on the river when we make our 5-high flush draw on a paired board. It's possible we could still stack our opponent, especially if he's bad. But because he has so many better hands in his range, the net result there is that we're going to have reverse implieds over the long run, and we want to avoid that situation. Now, many players get that. They understand that you have to be careful with dominated draws, especially the more obvious example. For example, we have a 1-card gut shot and we have the lower end of the gut shot. Players get that. So board texture is 6, 7, 8, and we have a 4. Yes, if we hit a 5, we're going to have a straight. Straights are good, but obviously any 9 is going to have us beat in that situation. We don't want to be drawing to those types of hands. Most players get that. The types of hands that players don't always realize suffer from reverse implieds is made hands as opposed to draws, mediocre made hands that are very unlikely to improve. So we're talking about things like pairs, especially things like pocket pairs, because any situation where we have a pair with a board, we often still have 5 outs. We can make good strong hands like 2-pair trips. Whereas let's say we have something like pocket 8s and there's already overcards out there. This hand can only improve on 2 cards on the next street. It's going to be a hand that's very unlikely to improve. It's a hand where our direct pot odds don't matter too much. We're going to see that demonstrated very shortly. And also, we don't want to spin things too far down the line of pessimism. We have to keep in mind that there are some good things that can happen on the river, even if our draw is dominated. For example, maybe we get the ability to bluff on the river. And in some senses, our ability to bluff is almost like a type of implied odds. It helps to counteract our reverse implieds. We'll see some examples of this also. Firstly, let's return to our original model with the option to bet the river. So we decide to check call with our flush draw on the turn. We've made one small alteration to the situation. Notice now that the 2 of diamonds is not the 3 of diamonds, it's now the 2 of diamonds, and it's paired the board. We know that this means that on certain rivers, our opponent is potentially going to be making a full house. Now what we've done here is a situation where we bet if we make our flush on the river, always. But we've decided the only time our opponent is going to call our river bet now is if he makes a full house. So it's a little bit of an extreme example, but this is clearly a model where we don't have any implied odds. We can say that because we never get paid off when we make our flush. Our opponent always folds when he doesn't have a hand better than ours, so it's essentially the same as saying that it goes check-check. We're going to win, but we're not going to win anything additional to what we've invested on the turn. However, let's say the very low frequency that our opponent makes a full house here, he's going to call. In other words, you can clearly see this is a situation where best case scenario is we break even, but there's also a way that we can lose additional money here. So it's almost like our opponent has a free roll against us. We can never actually make any money here, but those few times where he makes the boat, we're actually going to lose a bit of money. So we're going to run this model now, and what we expect to see is that our expectation is going to be negative. Originally the expectation was something like minus 0.006. Let's see what it is now. We can see our EV has dropped to minus 1.09. So as a result of our reverse implieds here, it doesn't matter that we get the direct pot odds. Remember, we're getting roughly a break-even call here. So it's very easy to say, well, I have this many outs, I'm going to hit this amount of the time, I can call this break-even. And by the way, this applies even if we get slightly more than the pot odds we need. So maybe we're actually going to hit 20% of the time and we only need to hit 15. If our reverse implied odds get too big, we should still make the fold in this situation. So here's a spot where we get the direct pot odds, but we still have to make the fold in this spot because our opponent is just not putting any additional chips in on the river when we hit. Now, the effect on our expectation is not huge here. And the reason is simply that our opponent doesn't make a full house very much. He has king-queen. So he's really only going to make a full house if the river's going to be either a queen or a deuce. We can make the effect of that slightly more severe by saying our opponent actually has something like ace deuce. So notice he has a full house or better 7.92% of the time. Let's now give him ace deuce instead. Let's run that. We can now see that he has a full house 11.1% of the time. See our expectation has dropped to 3.92. Let's do the absolute most extreme possible situation, which is our opponent already has a full house. And this is very, very pessimistic. But let's see what kind of effect it has on our expectation here. It's going to be pretty bad, we know that much. See our expectation drops now to minus 17 big blinds in this case. Now once again, don't worry too much about the exact values, because if we wanted to take exact values away from this, we'd have to make the model more realistic. We're just interested in qualitatively what's happening here and which factors make our expectation drop and how reverse implieds work and which kind of situations we need to be aware of the possibility that we have reverse implieds on a later street. So here's one of them. We have a flush draw, but the board's already paired. We could be drawing dead, or even if we're not drawing dead, we probably shouldn't expect that all of our 9 outs are live with 100% frequency. But I'd like to just show you the flip side to this, which is, let's say our opponent's playing in this kind of situation where he is clearly calling too tight. He's actually folding a lot here. The issue here is that we're just not exploiting that very well because we're only betting when we have a flush. So one of the ways that we can use this to our advantage is actually to take advantage of the good bluffing spot that our opponent's clearly giving us in this place. So just because he's only calling full houses doesn't mean that we can't play profitably in this situation. The issue now is we don't want to be checking when we don't have a flush. We want to be using this good bluffing opportunity. Now as a rough guide, you're probably not going to be check calling the turn too much and then bluffing the river out of position, although maybe this line does have some application on various board runouts. This is a kind of line that's going to work a lot better in position. And what we should really see from this, as a rough guide, you can be a little bit less concerned about situations where maybe the board's paired or you have a dominated draw if you think you're going to have pretty good fold equity on the river. Now although we're out of position in this model, we can also think of this as representing a spot where maybe we call in position, our opponent checks to us on the river. We're just representing it in a rather backwards way. But the point is, let's say we have way too much fold equity on the river, even though we're probably not going to get a big payout when we hit. What we can do is just remove the checking option. I'm going to say we just bet every time, and our opponent's only calling with full houses. So we're going to bluff every single time we miss. And this is a very good exploit against someone who's only calling with full houses. Look what happens to our expectation now. So now we're just absolutely printing money. This is despite the fact that we can never expect our draw to get paid off by worse. Now the reason we're looking at this model and the application that we should draw from this is that there are situations in poker, especially in position, where it's still going to be correct to call with a heavily dominated draw. What's more, there are situations where your best response to opponent is actually going to be to call with this heavily dominated draw and then even fold when that draw hits some of the time because you're never going to get action from worse. Or perhaps you make your draw, your opponent checks to you, and then your best response there is actually going to be to check back your made draw. But the main value in the play comes from the fact that if your opponent checks and you miss, you can now turn your hand into a bluff. And generally being aware of this idea is going to help us to find elegant solutions to certain trouble hands where it seems like we should never be folding on the turn just because we have so many outs, but by the same token we don't like the idea of calling the turn and then calling a big bet on the river. And generally speaking, the best play in these spots may sometimes be to actually call the turn and then fold the river when we hit, but if we both miss and our opponent checks the river, we turn our hand into a bluff. So it's generally not a line that players necessarily think of, despite there being several situations where it's actually going to be the best line. Call the turn with your draw, fold if you hit. If you hit and your opponent checks, depending on what his check means, might be a good idea just to check back, although who knows, you might be able to thin value bet, but generally you might have to check back when you hit. But the main value is going to come from the fact your opponent is playing too tight, and that's also why you can't actually call when you draw hits, or you can't value bet when you draw hits, because most of your expectations are going to come from this bluffing opportunity. So you can see an example of this here, even though we did actually do things backwards, so we just use the out of position model here, but it illustrates the same kind of idea. the guy's folding too much. So even though our draw is heavily dominated, our fold equity means we now have a profitable float. So if we do think we have fold equity on the later street, this gives us a rough idea why even dominated draws can sometimes still be okay in position, whereas assuming that we're not going to suddenly start donk bet bluffing out of position on the river, those same hands might not be very good check calls out of position on the turn. The other thing to keep in mind here is, just because we call the turn with a draw, doesn't mean that we're committed to calling the river even if we hit our draw. Now that's a little bit of a strange concept to get your head around, because generally speaking, if we call with a draw and hit, we feel like we're committed to actually calling the bet on the next street. Conversely, if we feel that we can't call that bet on the next street, we have this feeling that it's probably correct to fold our draw on the current street. There are situations where you call your draw on the current street, and then you just fold against a big bet when it hits. Sounds strange, but you can demonstrate this with card runners EV using models similar to the one that we've looked at just now. Here we call not because of our draw as such, but due to our fold equity on later streets. If we hit our draw, we're actually just going to play very, very cautiously with it, but we don't want to fold our draw because according to this model, the expectation of calling here is absolutely huge because our opponent is playing the river so inaccurately. We're going to look now at another similar hand where the concept of reverse implied odds applies. And it's a spot which is maybe less obvious in the situation where we hold some type of draw. And this is a scenario where we hold a made hand which doesn't improve very well. And the mistakes players make in this spot occur much more frequently. So generally good players are aware of the idea that if the board's paired, your flush draw might not be that good. But for some reason, this same concept, while it applies almost exactly to this situation, doesn't seem to sink in, even in the case of good players. So the spot here is the same board texture, Queen 7 deuce, the turn's a deuce. This time we have pocket eights. It's a type of hand that doesn't really improve very well. There aren't really many good cards for us on the river, apart from an 8, which is obviously a great card if that happens, and we do have good implied odds if the river's an 8. It's just that the river's going to be an 8 very, very infrequently. We don't really want to go around waiting for that to happen. We just don't have the odds to try and spike a 2-outer on the river. Our opponent would have to bet very small for that to be the case. So I'm going to assume that while that's a good scenario for us, it's not going to happen with the right frequency to justify a call on the turn. Now we've given our opponent a very specific range here. Doesn't really matter too much what the holdings are. The reason why I say specific range is we've deliberately done it so it gives us a pot odds call according to equity with our pocket eights. So the guy has some king-queen combos which obviously beat our 8s, although we do have our 2-outs against that. And then we've given him some flush draws, which our 8s are good against, but these hands have live equity against our 8s. So it's not necessarily going to be great for us on some river cards, because he could have a flush some of the time. So obviously his range will be a bit more diverse than just having top pair and flush draws, but let's have a look at the situation in terms of equity first of all. So we're facing a half pot bet, roughly. It means we need about 25% equity to make the call. If you have a look, we actually have 26.2% equity. What that means is we should probably make the call here. Our expectation is going to be positive, or at least that's what players can easily believe. Now, if he was all in, then it's very, very different. In fact, if the guy's all in here and we have pocket 8s, it's a pretty straightforward call. We get to fully realize our equity for the price that we're given, which is him betting 10.8 into a pot of 20. But as you can already see in this model, our expectation is nowhere near break even, despite the fact that we get the direct pot odds. Our expectation is very, very negative here. And it all comes down to future play, as you might expect. So let's see what happens on the river. So we check our pocket 8s, and we're assuming the guy just bets every time. And actually, as the model stands at the moment, it's assuming that we just call down against his entire range. So he's going to bet whether he has a flush draw or not. We just call down. You can see our expectation is hugely limited in this case. Now, let's just compare that to a slightly more optimal model, which we're not going to generate using this tree, obviously, because each player doesn't have enough strategic options. But let's just say that we're going to make the frequencies a little bit better for the later streets while working within the confines of this model. We can see that the expectation here doesn't need to be quite that bad. So what we're assuming now is that our opponent has the option to check as well. So he's not going to bet every single time, and we're actually going to call some of the time as well. So what we just saw now was almost a worst case model, but we can basically see that it's actually better just to fold directly on the turn because our opponent has the ability to add that additional pressure on us on the later streets. Now, of course, another question is whether he's going to put that additional pressure on us because, of course, it might actually end up going check-check in the case that he's especially passive, although it probably won't go check-check with his entire range, but he might check with a higher frequency, so we get an equity realization bonus there. In other words, our opponents could make mistakes on the later streets, which means that the EV of a check call is not as bad as it could be. But as you can see here, even when we use the equilibrium solve in Cardarana's EV, we can't really generate a break-even check call, purely as a result of the reverse implied odds we're going to face on the river. Now, what is a practical method we can use to maybe analyze what the true price we need on the turn is in this case? Well, let's just say we know he's going to bet the river with a high frequency, which we won't, and we're generally going to make sure that we weight his betting size by the frequency he bets as a rough guide. But let's say we know he's going to bet 30 on the river with a very high frequency, let's say 100% frequency. In fact, what we'll do is remove his option to check very shortly. Well, essentially, in order to get to showdown, we don't just have to call 10, we actually have to call 10 plus whatever he's going to invest on the next street. We actually have to call 40. What we can pretty much do, therefore, is just imagine that he's betting 40 right away. So the 20 in the middle, he's betting 40, we'd be investing 40 into a total pot of 100, therefore we need 40% equity. So what we should find is, even in this model, if we roughly adjust the equity to about 40%, we'll find that we have a break-even cooldown. So first of all, let's just remove his option to check. Let's say he is really going to bet with 100% frequency in this case. We're just going to edit the conditions here so that he bets all hands, as opposed to the previous model where he bets some of them but not all of them. Equity is going to remain the same on the turn, of course, 26.2%. So what we're going to do now is we're going to play around with our equity so that we have more equity. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to remove some of his king-queen combos. So I paused there slightly and figured out that we have roughly 40% equity if he has exactly 10 of his king-queen combos. Also made a small change to the tree where we don't have the option to fold anymore. So committed to calling down. And we're expecting our EV to be roughly 0 in this case. And you can see that it is indeed roughly 0. So we're treating his turn bet as if he's also making his river bet. And the idea here is we added the numbers directly because he's betting with 100% frequency. But if he doesn't bet with 100% frequency, let's say you get to realize your equity 50% of the time, I suppose that's almost the same as saying he's actually betting 15 on a later street. The idea is you really have to think in terms of how much is it going to cost you in the long run to realize your equity. And that is not the amount that you're facing on the turn, unless that turn bet happens to be all in. There is the threat of additional firepower from our opponent on the next street. And by the way, this is closely linked to a concept known as leverage. The basic idea here is that our opponent's bet or potential bet on the river is actually impacting on the price we need to make our turn call. So if you have this exact same turn situation, but you assume river's check-check, suddenly this is a very profitable turn call because we have 40% equity and we only need 25. But you just add in the threat of that possible river play and we suddenly need a lot more equity just to make a break-even turn call. This is a concept known as leverage. Our opponent's chips in his stack are working in his favor despite the fact that he hasn't invested them yet. The mere threat, his mere ability to invest those chips on a later street, influences the price we get on an earlier street. This is known as leverage. Now, if we think about that in reverse, what this typically means is that the deeper our stacks are when we are the aggressor, the more we can get away with bluffing. It's just going to be a lot harder for our opponent to make these cooldowns knowing that we still have big bullets left to fire on the later street. To think about how that applies as the defender, the shallower the stacks get, the more we care about raw equity. The deeper the stacks get, the less raw equity matters, because pocket eights is an example of a hand here which has pretty good raw equity. but that's useless in this scenario. We'd rather have something like the nut flush draw on a non-paired board, because even if this hand only has 20% equity or so, it's a hand that can very profitably be defended when the stacks are deep because our implied odds work for us. They work in our favor. We don't need to get the direct pot odds in order to have a profitable call. Whereas pocket eights here is an example of a hand where we clearly get the direct pot odds, but our opponent can make it non-profitable for us anyway. We have some serious equity realization issues here due to the leverage that our opponent has. If we just do one final thing to this model, let's make the river go check check. And we'll see now that this is a very, very profitable turn call if we're all in. A situation where raw equity is very useful for us. You can see our EV there is 6.13. But if we assume now we're playing a very deep stacked model, and our opponent just decides to overbet shove and we cool down, now we're in a situation where our expectation is going to be negative. The leverage effect is too severe here. So despite the fact that we're getting exactly the same price on the turn, we're actually losing money now. And this is a mistake players make. They get to the turn, they plug in their opponent's range, they look at their pot odds and say, okay, I need 25% equity. I've got 40% equity, great, easy, cool. No, not necessarily. Depends what your opponent's going to do on the next street. See here, clearly have the pot odds to call. Our expectation is very negative though. Would have been better to check fold. Okay, so let's summarize. There are two main points here which pretty much summarize everything. Number one, be careful with pot odds. Pot odds don't even really matter that much in poker. The only time we care about pot odds is if we are all in. You know, we saw some examples of pre-flop, very, very common mistakes. Players look at their pot odds pre-flop. No one cares about your pot odds pre-flop. It doesn't have any bearing on the expectation of the situation unless you just so happen to be really, really shallow. You can basically ignore pre-flop pot odds. We always have to think about the impact of future play, assuming that we're not all in. If we're not all in, we don't care about pot odds. And the deeper the remaining stacks, the more play there is left for the future streets, the less relevant pot odds become. So if you're playing a really, really deep stack situation, and you're trying to make a pre-flop decision, and you're looking at the guy's sizing and saying, oh, well, it's a very small sizing, I should therefore call, I clearly have the pot odds, it actually doesn't matter too much. You actually care more about your post-flop expectation because you still have most of the chips left to play with post-flop. So always consider future play, both the pros and the cons. So we're not just talking about getting paid off here. That's not the only aspect to implied odds. We're also talking about bluffing ability on later streets. That's a form of implied odds. Perhaps the call itself is roughly break even, but if every single time our opponent doesn't follow up with a barrel, he check folds, we actually could say that we have good implied odds in that situation. But once again, maybe we would want to call that something different. Really comes back to this whole reasons for betting thing. We don't have to put labels on things. We can see that bluffing potential on later street functions in a similar way to implied odds, a similar way to the type of implied odds where we get paid off by a worse hand. So do we need to give it a different label? Maybe we should. But the whole point of this series has been that it's the maths that we care about. It's that number, our expectation. We don't care what we call stuff. We're referring to this as implied odds when we get to bluff the river just because it's easy. We could make up another name for it. It really doesn't matter too much. We understand that the ability to bluff a later street can have a positive impact on our expectations, so we want to be aware of that when making decisions on earlier streets. We've also seen that that can actually be the key component and a reason for defending a very marginal draw on the turn. There may be situations where we call with a draw, and even though we make our draw, we should actually fold against the barrel, but if our opponent checks, we have a very good bluff hand, assuming we miss our draw. So always consider future play. It's a lot more dynamic than just how often do we get paid off. And we've also seen this concept of leverage, where as a defender, we have to think about how often is our opponent going to be following up, especially when we have a hand that doesn't improve very well. So if we have a hand that improves very well, like a flush draw, we like our opponent to follow up, because if he follows up, it means we get a bigger payout. But now take something that doesn't improve very well, like pocket eights. Now we don't really want our opponent to follow up too much, because the more he follows up and the bigger he bets, the more marginal our hand becomes, to the point where even if he's min-betting the turn, it might still be correct to fold if we know he's going to proceed by firing a huge overbet on the river. Must always consider future play. Okay, so congratulations, you have finished this series on fundamental theorems. You should now have some insights, especially mathematical insights regarding the expectation of certain lines that the average player in your games does not have. Some of the things that we've discussed are not necessarily common knowledge, even amongst good players. Just keep in mind that even now, the state of the games is such that there are players who are winning but don't fully understand what they're doing and are still making significant errors in very many parts of their game. So the concepts you've learned in this video, if you've been able to understand them and internalize them, these are concepts that can potentially put you ahead of the field. You're going to have a much stronger technical understanding of how your decisions are going to impact upon your expectation. Alright, that's it. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks for watching this series on fundamental theorems. Look forward to catching you in other series. This has been Weasel for PokerWeasel.com.